Good morning from Washington. I'm Karen Donfried with GMF, and I want to welcome all of you to this event on a transatlantic approach to fighting the pandemic. GMF is delighted to organize this event with our partners at the Embassy of Slovakia here in Washington. We have the opportunity to learn from Slovakia's experience fighting COVID-19, thanks to the participation of State Secretary Majer at the Ministry of Defense in Slovakia. And the State Secretary is just coming from a 7-hour government meeting about the pandemic and specifically about mass testing in Slovakia. So he really has been actively and deeply involved in fighting the pandemic. We also were joined by Peter Gajdoš, who is the executive chairman of IPM Chirana, which represents a strategic partnership between Europe's leading infratech asset manager, IPM Group, and the Slovak company Chirana Medical that has created and rapidly accelerated global production of the Aura 5 ventilators. And the company has also been very engaged in developing therapeutics and vaccines for COVID-19. Because we very much wanted to explore the transatlantic dimension of this issue, we wanted to include an American voice on this issue of fighting the pandemic. And there is no better person in my mind to help us think through that transatlantic response than General John Allen, the president of Brookings. General Allen was a member of a transatlantic task force that GMF organized together with the Bundeskanzler Helmut Schmidt Stiftung. And one of the 6 issues that we looked at was fighting the pandemic. And General Allen's brilliance and creativity shown in crafting those recommendations. And I would commend that report to all of you. It's available on the GMF website. And more recently, General Allen co-authored an article in The Atlantic that called for creating a COVID commission, where we could look at the lessons we've learned from our response to this pandemic. I am delighted to have all 3 of you help us think through how we can best overcome the current health crisis we face. Before we jump into the discussion, I want to encourage everybody who's tuned in to submit questions through the Q&A function in Zoom. I'm planning to have a brief conversation with our speakers, and then I'm going to turn to your questions, and I will try to pull in as many as I can. And I would just ask that you identify yourself when you send in those questions. So now let's learn from the incredible talent we have assembled here today. And Mr. State Secretary, let me begin with you. One of the striking steps that Slovakia has taken in combating the pandemic has been mass testing. We've all watched it with great interest from the United States. Can you explain to us what made you decide to take that test and how you implemented it? I know the Ministry of Defense played a big role in the implementation. How well has it worked? What have you learned from that? So, Mr. State Secretary, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for introductory words, and thank you also GMF for organizing this debate. It's from our point of view, let me say that it's very important to share our knowledge, our lessons with not only with European countries but also with United States and vice versa. So this is very important for us, and it's very clear that sharing knowledge. It's regarding pandemic, but regarding many other security issues is something which makes this transatlantic bond very strong. So this is very important, and we learned that the sharing of lessons and sharing the information is something which can help us also for the future crisis situation, regardless what they will be. Coming back to your question, yes, mass testing was something which was a very topical question last fall here in Slovakia, and it's starting to be again right now as the situation and the figures are getting worse and worse in Slovakia these days. So as you mentioned, I came back from quite a long governmental session, which was devoted to what we should do in upcoming days and weeks with the situation in Slovakia. Now, the death rate here in regards to COVID is one of the worst in the world. So we've got about 100 people are dying every day. Most of them in the hospitals, some of them at home, and also the number of those who are staying in hospital is getting higher. This is still, I would say, manageable situation, but without any serious measures taken, it could be on the edge of our capacities to deal with the situation. And we were getting to that situation also in the fall. As I said, it was October when we had several regions which were we call it black, so with very high positivity rate and very bad situation in the hospitals, and we decided to go for testing of the whole population, but starting with the 4 counties in Slovakia. Altogether, it was about 140,000 people, and then next week with the rest of Slovakia. So we and then in the 3rd week we tested approximately half of Slovakia according to the results of the previous rounds of testing. Altogether, we tested 5.8 million people, and the positivity rate with antigen tests was 2.26%. So it means altogether we've been able to pull out, as we say it, more than 50,000 people who were tested positive with the antigen tests. So it means that they were in the worst period of the disease, and they were the most, I would say, they were in the position to spread the disease mostly in that period of maybe 4 or 5 days. Regarding the position of armed forces, it was very difficult to find anybody else, I would say, any other institution which would be able to conduct this kind of operation. And even for us, it was something very, very difficult. And it was a task of the government, so we didn't have a choice. But at the same time, we made questions to ourselves whether we are able to do so. Of course, it was the operation which needed cooperation with the municipalities, with healthcare institutions, with hospitals, with the police, of course, and firefighters, and so on and so forth. So altogether, this operation was conducted with about 40,000 people at a time. Out of those, 8,000 were soldiers. So it means that it was in the Slovak history, in the Slovak modern history, the biggest logistical operation, and especially when it comes to logistics, it was something very challenging. Now the situation is a little bit different, because the there is some experience, I would say, and especially experience of municipalities. So now we are able to contribute to any kind of mass testing which would be conducted in Slovakia according to the decision of the government, but most probably the role of the armed forces will be only supportive, not the leading. So it means that now the responsibility will be spread, and that is quite clear, will be spread among more institutions and among more regional authorities, I would say, in Slovakia.
Let me just ask a short follow-on. Did you have any issue with having enough tests for that kind of a massive testing program last fall in particular? I mean, I know supplies have gotten better now, but was there also cooperation with the private sector on that? Or was that not a problem in Slovakia, getting that number of tests?
Of course, the cooperation with the private sector was very important, not only when it comes to this mass testing, but it started already in the spring, especially in regards to PCR testing, which was being done since April, I would say. So we've been able to, of course, we need to keep in mind that Slovakia is quite a small country compared to big countries like United States or Germany or France. So altogether, we needed, for one round of testing, we needed up to 4 million tests. Because some groups of population like teenagers and children were not testing, or they were not asked to be tested, and also that's the same is true with people above over 65 years old. But having in short, we've been able to buy enough tests in quite a short time. Ministry of Defense was in the role of actually being institution which was controlling these tests, which made quite big questions also for us from many other institutions afterwards, because we still had in the stockpiles tests also needed for next rounds of regional testing. We were able to do so. Now, of course, the situation is a little bit different because the requirements for this kind of tests also from other countries is maybe higher, but and there are some complicated processes when it comes to procurement in Slovakia according to law. So it's not an easy task to do it in a week or two, but we've been able to do so somehow, I would say, because sometimes it's about flexibility of everybody who is involved. And this is what we learned, that there is some flexibility of institutions and flexibility of officials, but the crisis management is not about. It should be about flexibility. It should be about direct rules and procedures. So this is something which we also learned, but it's not only about Slovakia, that some procedures are not working. Some procedures need to be changed in the future. But coming back to your question, yes, we've been able to procure tests, but at the same time, the cooperation with private sector, especially when in regards to PCR tests, and especially in regards to research and some kind of identification of virus and follow-up measures was very important, and this is something where we see private companies as very helpful and very important.
Thanks so much. General Allen, let me come to you now, because as the State Secretary pointed out, Slovakia is a small country. And General Allen, when you think about how the US is doing in the fight against COVID-19 today, what do you see the role for something like mass testing as being? And what's the interaction between testing and the vaccine rollout? So
Sure.
over to you.
Well, first, it's wonderful to be with you all this morning, Karen. Thank you for bringing us together. Thank you for the leadership that you and GMF bring to so many of these issues. It's wonderful to see the state secretary again, and it's great to meet Peter. And I just have to say, he may get to it, but I have to say, we would not be in the situation we're in the United States, which is, I think, on the edge of starting to see some progress, if it wasn't for the private sector. In many respects, the private sector and the scientists and the health professionals have saved us in many respects. It's important to say, important to make the point, several points. And I don't want to get off track about COVID, but in the United States, apart from perhaps how it's being dealt with in Slovakia or other countries, we have multiple intersecting influences that have both exacerbated the problem and also made it difficult for us to deal with it. So it's not just a medical crisis for us. We talk about the coin associated with the disease. We have on one side of the coin the disease itself and the effects, the medical effects of the coin, of the disease. On the other side, inextricably linked to that is the economic downturn. So that has created a major social and economic crisis for the country, which has complicated the capacity for us to deal with the medical crisis. And then apart from Slovakia or other countries, the United States last year had a major racial and social justice reckoning that really transited the entire country. That's an issue as well, especially within our Black and brown populations and their sense of disenfranchisement traditionally, but now that has been massively exposed by the disease. The infection rate within those populations and the absence of the medical capacity really to take care of them. And then we have the issue of the politicization of the disease, akin to or as an adjunct to the processes and the difficulties we've had with the presidential election and the aftermath of that. So those forces are all at work. So with respect to dealing with the crisis, and it's going to get worse before it gets better, sadly, we will next Wednesday for our international audience, we will inaugurate the 46th president of the United States, President Biden. By then, the United States will probably have 25 million Americans infected. So I'm conscious of the population of Slovakia. Nearly 5 times the population of Slovakia will have been infected. By that date, we will probably have 400,000 dead and 4,000 dying a day. So how we got here is a failure of many of those processes to intersect at the moment of need. So one of the difficulties, Karen, that we have and for the international audience is the United States is a federal system. Imagine the 50 states as being independent countries, which we were originally in the colonies, who have come together and surrendered certain sovereignty to the central government for national crises. And in this case, we had, I don't want to get too political about this, but we had a massive failure of leadership at the national level. Because we don't have a national public health system relying on the federal government to produce much of that, we had a problem in many ways at the very beginning of this. We didn't have a national testing process. We didn't have a national testing, tracking and tracing process, and we still don't. We didn't put to work the Defense Production Act, which would have stimulated the private sector in many respects to produce the PPE, the personal protective equipment necessary for our frontline workers to be able to exist in this highly infectious problem and disease, to include the production of ventilators, which we desperately needed very early along, and Peter was frankly part of the massive solution out of the private sector in this. We didn't have the therapeutics necessary to treat those who were now sick and in the hospitals, to get them out of beds, get them home so we could have those beds available. We've done much better on that now, but it's still not broadly corrected. And then finally, the vaccine itself. Now, I think in many respects, this is a bright spot in this process for the United States and for our friends around the world, because as we know, for this kind of a disease, having a vaccine could take years to produce. And the warp speed program that President Trump put into effect produced these in months, months. We could never have imagined that we could see these vaccines come online. Now, they're not fully vetted, but emergency use has been granted to them. And I think while there would be some who would like to see much more testing done, we got enough done. We need to get them into arms. And so it's testing, tracing, and tracking, the PPE for the people that have to fix us, the therapeutics that have to make us well when we're in the hospital, and now the vaccine. And you may want to talk about it later, but the vaccine piece of this thing is enormous for the United States. It is as the State Secretary just said, it is a huge logistics challenge, from production to putting it in the arm. That is a huge production challenge. First of all, the United States is a big country. So the lines of communications are just long. Second, we have the federal and the state system. And I just described why that can become very inefficient very quickly without the right kinds of leadership. And then we have the challenges associated with an absence of a federal or a national health system, which leaves the administration of the vaccine in the hands of states, many of whom are just doing it on their own in many respects. So that is a challenge. Could there be a national testing program? Well, I don't think that President Biden intends to do that, although he wants to put 100 million doses into the arms of 100 million Americans in the first 100 days. But what he would need to do is, of course, bring the states in and have a consensus that first, that the states would consent to it, and second, that we would have the capacity to produce enough tests to test the entire country at one fell swoop. So there are logistics, there are governmental, and there are technical problems associated with that. So let me just stop there, Karen, see if I answered your question.
Yeah, let me do one follow-up with you, which is, when you started by defining the different elements of this crisis, and the first one you defined was medical. And in a sense, that's also been the most positive response. And in that response, we've also seen real transatlantic cooperation. You mentioned the vaccine, and of course, the first one out of the gates was the joint production of Pfizer and BioNTech, an American and a German company.
That's right.
If we think about the role governments play in also combating the pandemic, is there more at this moment in the pandemic that you think the US government could do in cooperation with its European partners that would have a real impact for our meeting this challenge?
Yeah, there's no question that there is. Look, President Obama asked me to help him to form a global coalition to counter the Islamic State. And the numbers of people that they killed were horrendous, but nothing like this crisis. And so immediately, the United States should have, didn't, and in some respects is now beginning to gain some traction in this regard. We will certainly see it under the Biden administration. Should have sought to create a similar global, certainly transatlantic, coalition to bring together our medical and scientific capabilities. And in some respects it has. You point properly to tremendous European medical capabilities that produce and help to make these viruses. But then very importantly, how do we deal with the transnational dimension of this? Transnational travel, for example, transnational transportation of PPE. Brookings was getting PPE sent to us by friends in China so that we could distribute it to hospitals in Washington, D.C. This is insane. So a multilateral approach to those areas that I talked about. And if I were to have designed a campaign, Karen, I would have wanted a multilateral campaign, transatlantic to start with, but global thereafter, that would have created pandemic surveillance. Where are the hot spots? Where do we need to put special attention? Vaccine development. Now, that happens sort of organically, but it could have been, I think, more systematically led by a transatlantic coalition with American leadership, not American hegemony, but American leadership. Development of a therapeutic so we can get our individual citizens well and out of hospital beds so that we've got the capacity, as the State Secretary said, in the United States is facing right now, our hospitals are full. And then a multilateral approach to testing, tracking, and tracing. A multilateral approach to PPE production, because some countries are going to be unable to produce it. We ought to have those countries that can produce extra. We should be laser focused on producing it for them and shipping it to them in a multilateral program. And then finally, working together multilaterally in a campaign to deal with the enormous global logistics that'll be necessary to solve all of those problems, but very importantly, get the shots in the arms of as many people in the populations of the Transatlantic Coalition as we possibly can. If we had started with that mindset, we'd be in a very different place right now.
Super, thanks. And I want to bring Mr. Gajdoš in now, and I'm so happy to have a private sector voice as part of this conversation, because we heard both from the State Secretary and from General Allen how important your role has been. And as we learn more about COVID-19, I mean, out of the gate, we all understood that one of the first things this virus attacks is our lungs. So the demand for the ICU ventilators that you produce has been extremely high throughout this crisis. Can you share with us how this played out in your company and really use that case study of the ventilators to help all of us understand the role the private sector is playing in this fight against COVID-19?
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. So to give everybody a picture, Chirana was a small company based in Slovakia with a very good technology in the ventilation world. Within days or weeks, they sold out, especially because of the demand of the local government. And we realized, well, hang on a second. So, okay, we can meet the demands of the Slovak governments and maybe a couple more. What about the rest of the world? So Chirana, unfortunately, did not have production capacity and people inside its own organization. So we wanted to look around, where can we find an FDA-approved facility and people to do this? And, me being originally from Slovakia, having an American wife living in San Francisco, understanding the sector, I said, well, I raised my hand in April, we can do this. We went to Boston. Boston is obviously a huge center for medical devices and for healthcare. If any other country or any other place in the world can do this fast, it was Boston. So we went to Boston. Normally, this process would take 2 to 3 years. That's a standard time to transfer medical devices to a new facility. Just to give you a sense of complication, it was thousands and thousands of pages of translations of drawings, documentation. You have, on top of that, you have 1,200 components that go to a ventilator. We realized that there were no shortcuts. In the United States, did manage to produce in the end 140,000 ventilators, so which is a fantastic number. But then when you start thinking what's in that 140,000, 125,000 of those are so-called emergency ventilators that are only suitable for a few hours. So unfortunately, the real number of ventilators are only 15,000, which doesn't sound that good. And that's why we're seeing triaging in the hospitals in the United States, because those are the ventilators that can stay on patients for 2-3 weeks. And unfortunately, those 125 can help for a few hours, and that's about it. So the other big part of this was the component challenge, and we're still dealing with it. And while there has been some help and focus of the governments and the private sector, it's a continuing issue. And although you can ramp up our manufacturing facility, it's very hard to ramp up other manufacturing facilities around the world. I am happy to say that by wave 2, we have succeeded, and we have completed a transfer within 6 months. So unfortunately, we did not catch wave 1. We caught wave 2, and we're now producing and sending ventilators to patients. We actually are sending units to NATO, to their reserves. So talking about transatlantic cooperation right there, and NATO uses it obviously for other states. We just had a patient in Chennai, India, and it's truly heartbreaking to see the exact same pictures around the world. We're looking at Latin American countries in the mountains of Peru. This crisis has hit every single corner of the world, and the picture is always the same: person with a heart failure, a lung failure, on a ventilator. So I think what has proven to be here is that so I think the markets like European Union and US will find a way to do some of the work, but there's a forgotten tale of the countries that have no way of pulling real ICU ventilators. So that's what we see right now as a role. We are supplying some of these markets that are, and countries that are in a dire need. I think what's next is, a reckoning. I think there's a realization that, I'll speak about the ventilators, I can speak about the site. It's not just quantity, it's quality that matters. We ought to really use the best products, the best therapeutics, the best availability. So I think in a rush for getting something out, we took some shortcuts, and it hurt us in the end. If you saw the death rates in New York on ventilators at the beginning was 85%. That was because of a lack of procedures, lack of knowledge. Now the death rates are much lower, and they are probably in the 50s and the 60s, which is still not excellent, but we could have saved a lot of people if we followed procedures rather than rushing. To end the opening on a positive note, though, I do see the learnings, and I do see the progress. And as General Allen said, I think if we look back 20 years from now, everybody will speak about Operation Warp Speed the same way they spoke about, other major, when we went to the moon, or the Project Manhattan and other things. This is one of the major scientific achievements I've ever seen in my life. The speed and the focus of those people, I think a lot of people will receive a lot of awards for that. So that's kind of my finishing statement on that. And that was a fantastic example of cooperation of private public sector, Turkish immigrants in Germany, American scientists from Moderna, just incredible people who have done absolute miracles in an unprecedented time.
Well, right. There is a silver lining of a very dark cloud for sure. Let me just follow up with one more question for you, which is, as you know, the issue of supply of personal protective equipment has kicked off a debate about the security of supply chains. And there are some who say, well, wait, a lot of that PPE is coming from China. Should we pull those supply chains back and rely on domestic production for this critical PPE? What's your view of that on that supply chain debate?
So I think my view is, as a private sector person, I don't think you would want 100% of that production to be in your own country. At the same time, for a few cents on a dollar, we have given away security of supply. We have a domestic production of key therapeutics in North Carolina. I don't want to mention a company, right? This is not a forum. Without that company, a lot of the pain medications would not have been produced. It's absolutely critical to have certain level of production in domestic countries. I'm talking EU level, I'm talking US level, because otherwise you're reliant on transport and logistics. And it may not be even ill will of the countries. It's just physically impossible sometimes to ship things, especially in the middle of the pandemic. I can tell you horror stories of trying to fly people and things from across the countries to planes. So having a portion of guaranteed supply at any time, is important. And, I'm not a military person, but if you look at the preposition of supplies and look at the, guaranteed production, that's very much a common concept in the military. It should be a common concept in healthcare.
Mm-hmm. Super, thanks. And we do have a lot of questions rolling in, so thank you to those listening. And I'm going to start weaving those questions in. We have a couple of questions actually from Andrej Matasek, who is a journalist from the Slovak daily Pravda, and he sends greetings to all of you. And he has one question for the State Secretary and a question for General Allen. Mr. State Secretary, he says, let's be honest. Using of mass testing is becoming controversial. Today's long governmental meeting indicates this. There is no consensus how to move forward. It would be good to hear from you how you see this, and basically from, actually he's including, I think, both of our Slovak speakers. So Mr. Gajdoš, you can speak to this too. He would like our Slovak speakers to share how they see this, and basically from your perspective, what are the lessons here that Slovakia can share with others? And then I'll come to the question for General Allen. But Mr. State Secretary, why don't you kick off on that, the controversial side of mass testing?
I would like to thank Andrej for raising question. Yes, it's true that it's a controversial topic since the fall, I would say, since the situation was starting to getting worse and worse, maybe in September, October. But also today, we heard very strong arguments why the mass testing is working, and the argument is that also in the fall there was a combination of mass testing and lockdown measures. Some lockdown measures, of course, they can differ from country to country, but also Slovakia have taken some measures to somehow decrease the mobility of people and to maybe the probability of spreading the virus between the population. And the argument now we are hearing is that that time it was not mass testing, but the lockdown which worked, because it's true that after the mass testing, the situation and the figures were going down. And some people are saying that it's maybe just coincidence that the mass testing, we went through the mass testing because there was a lockdown at the same time, and that's why, especially because of the lockdown, the situation was getting better. And now with Christmas time, when or before Christmas, when the situation was getting worse and worse in Slovakia, many people advocated, especially for lockdown measures, and they were saying that the lockdown was what helped us also in the fall. But now we've got quite strong lockdown measures from starting 1st January at 5 o'clock in the morning. And now we've got 15th of January, and the situation is maybe slightly stabilized and maybe slightly going down, but not so down as we expected to go. So the argument is that again the mass testing, and the question is what mass testing it means, whether the whole population in Slovakia, maybe it's possible to do it as I said in Slovakia, but it's not possible to do it in Germany, for example. But at the same time we are saying that the situation in Slovakia, in all counties in Slovakia, is very severe and very difficult, and it's very difficult to make some distinctions between some regions. But what many people argue, and I agree with them, is that let's combine the mass testing with lockdown again, because combined effort of testing and lockdown, and at the same time vaccination, of course, would help the curve to change the curve of the situation. So what was in Slovakia, what was not the positive feature was that there was not the unified and maybe strong communication of the government, and that's why there were many questions which were not maybe answered by proper manner from the political figures of Slovakia. That's why it became a controversial issue. But of course, it's something which now it's much easier to make decisions than it used to be a couple months ago, maybe in the fall, because Slovakia had a very, I would say, modest situation in the spring, so we didn't have any experience in the fall, and now we can maybe make some comparisons with the fall with the situation in the autumn when making decisions. So maybe that's the reason why those decisions or decision making is so long, and why, for example, today's governmental meeting was so long without final decision, because we'd like to make a long-term or at least mid-term decision and make people to know what they should expect in upcoming weeks and months.
Super, thanks. And Mr. Gajdoš, let's hear your perspective on this.
On mass testing. So, I'm a little bit remote from the situation, so I don't want to step into it. I think there's definitely benefits. I think is the human aspect of fatigue that is important, right? I think this is, I don't know, there have been several local rounds of testing, mass testing, so there's additional one. I think, the key is not just to conduct mass testing, but get very high adherence of population, actually participation. I think if I understand correctly, in round one, the participation was unheard of, was fantastic. I think there's a bit more resistance now. So I think to me, it's more about the communication and resource allocation, right? There's a big effort going on vaccination now. So if you have the resources to do that, and if the population adheres, it becomes very useful. If you don't have that, it becomes less useful. And the last piece I want to mention is, again, it's not the quantity, it's the quality. You need to have very good tests to do this. And I think, some countries around the world have used very bad rapid antigen tests. If you use good ones, you will have a much better result as well. So again, it's not just the speed, it's how you actually execute it. Can you get adherence of the population? Number one. Can you get the right tests? Number two. And number three, is it going to take away from the resources of the people that are now working on vaccination effort? If the country is rich enough or capable enough to do both, go for it. But I think that's the complication here. But again, I don't profess to be a specialist in this area of mass testing. So I'm more speaking about what I hear from the scientific community that I hear. So it's a secondhand.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks to you both. That's very interesting. And General Allen, the question that was posed for you here is, COVID Commission is a great idea. Any indications how the incoming Biden administration will react to this idea? So a question about that. And let me just throw in, another listener was also interested more broadly in the approach you think the Biden administration will take to global health issues. And they specifically were interested in whether the US under Biden would join the EU in trying to ensure that less developed countries get access to the vaccines. And actually, that was something that Mr. Gajdoš had spoken to. So General Allen, over to you.
Well, I'm not part of the administration. I'm watching very closely what is developing. My sense is that in ways the current administration has not been committed to multilateralism or inherently committed towards the transatlantic relationship. I think we will see a big change there. The new Secretary of State is one of the great globalists that we have known in a long time and has deep, deep roots in Europe. So I think that there will be an inherent bias by the United States to be involved multilaterally. It would make good sense for the United States to want to join with the EU on a broader, more comprehensive campaign in this regard. And I think that to the second question, I think we have an inherent, frankly, humanitarian and moral responsibility within a transatlantic multilateral approach, not just obviously to help each individual country within that relationship to overcome the disease and to flatten the curve and try to, in another aspect of it, try to help our mutual economic recovery as well, all of which is inextricably linked. I think we have a moral and a humanitarian responsibility to do what we can to assist the developing world as well. Remembering that one of the reasons of a COVID commission would be to point to failures in surveillance. Now, it's difficult to get good data and surveillance when you're looking into an authoritarian system that isn't inherently intending to be transparent with its own problem, which is China, and that's how it started. And I'm not going to spend any time beating up the Chinese here, because that's a different conversation also. But we have to have surveillance in the capacity of understanding what's happening in the global south, which is where much of the developing world, of course, exists. And what we find is climatologically, the disease will change in the north and south based on the climate. And if we don't have a comprehensive capacity to surveil the outbreak of the disease in the global south or in the developing world as we're trying to heal ourselves, that's the first problem. We'll never really get over it. And then the capacity to help the developing world on issues of testing, on issues of therapeutics, so that when they're sick, they can get better. And very importantly, on the issue of the vaccine. It can't be that the transatlantic relationship, and I know you and others of us on this call would never propose this, only take care of ourselves. I absolutely believe if we're going to come together as a transatlantic multilateral organization to deal with this disease comprehensively, we have a responsibility to the developing world as well, to across the board in all of those areas that I talked about. And then I just think that there's no way you can emerge from a crisis like this without having some form of a commission examine it from the moment of our initial sensing that there was a problem in China all the way to the final application of the vaccines, which in broad terms have made us healthy again. We've got to understand all of that. And one of the important things, and Peter touched it a couple of times, the logistics of getting well, the logistics of moving and administering the therapeutics, of moving and administering the vaccine. It's very difficult to overstate how complex that is, and how we'll have to have a real sharing of assets to do that. But we can't do that if we don't all have a common pandemic picture, which will come from transparency between and among the various countries within the multilateral organization, so we all operate off the same picture. So we know who's in trouble and who needs PPE. We know who's in trouble and they need ventilators. We know who's in trouble and they've got a bad vaccine from another place in the world. We got to ship a certain kind of vaccine to them. And then finally, Peter said this as well, and it's really important. One of the things that the military does and does well is we have strategic reserves. And if we come out of this and we don't see an inherent final step of dealing with COVID, and that final step is going to be a long time from now, as being preparing in every possible way for the next pandemic, and it's coming at us. It really is. Climate change is going to drive one pandemic after another if we're not ready. We have got to fully stock the strategic reserves of all the countries in the world with ventilators, with PPE, with therapy, with all of those things that will prepare us the next time our surveillance, global enhanced surveillance system depicts or detects something is emerging. We're not only able to deal with it as it is emerging, but if there's an outbreak, we're far better postured as a community of nations, first to have the mindset to go after it in a multilateral sense, but also individually as nations to be able to deal with it as it begins to emerge inside the population. And if we don't stock the strategic reserves of as many of the countries as we can, we will have failed in our humanitarian obligations as United States as a leader, but also as a transatlantic multilateral organization dealing with this.
Many thanks. Mr. State Secretary, there's a question from Heinrich Kraft. He says, we are now more than 10 months into the pandemic in Europe. How do you evaluate solidarity within the European Union from a Slovak perspective? And if I can just add a footnote onto that, I was curious in asking you what your expectations are of the EU virtual leaders meeting that will take place on January 21st on the issue of vaccine distribution. And again, from your perspective, what's the most important decision the EU leaders need to reach on the 21st? So back to you.
Thank you. We have to admit that in many aspects, this crisis, this pandemic, showed our first vulnerability, of course, but at the same time that we were not prepared for this kind of, in many aspects, for this kind of crisis. And I completely agree with what General Allen just said. We need, regardless when it will be, we need jointly analyze our failures and our problems. Now the situation is much better than it used to be 10 months ago, but it's something as I said at the very beginning, sometimes we helped ourselves with our flexibility and our preparedness to somehow manage and somehow deal, but not to follow procedures which are clear for everybody on the national level and on the international level. So this is the fact also about transatlantic and NATO cooperation, and also when it comes to situation and cooperation in the EU. So in the very beginning, there was very selfish, I would say, position of every single country, which find itself in the situation without sufficient reserves of medical material, with sufficient reserves of what was needed that time. And in that time, China was able to fill this gap. And in spite of for example, enormous effort which was done by the European Union for many countries afterwards, still China was perceived in Europe by Europeans that China was that country which helped us and not the European Union, which was not the truth. But the first I would say effort, the first step in the very beginning was made by China and maybe some other countries, not by European countries themselves. But I would say that afterwards, I'm talking about maybe after 1 month or 2 months, the coordination within the European Union, but also coordination within NATO, and exploiting of procedures which are there, but it were not used until the last year, or they were not used in such amount, is much better. So I would say just mentioning EU Emergency Response Coordination Center, EU Humanitarian Air Bridge, of course, the role of European Medical Agency when it comes to debate about vaccination and confirmation of the vaccines. Also debate about the economic recovery, creating recovery fund and the using of EU funds. This is everything what is supporting the argument that the role of European Union was very strong, and it's still very strong. And together with the United States, whether it's within NATO or outside of NATO, it's something which should be analyzed and should be used for the future. So I'm supporting debate on creating strategic reserves, supporting debate on international debate, how to make us stronger when it comes to planning, when it comes to research, when it comes to sharing of lessons learned, financing of the crisis management, and coordinating measures. So we are now in completely different situation as we used to be 10 months ago, thanks to this crisis. It has many negative aspects, but at the same time, it has a positive aspect of showing and it's very obvious that the solidarity between the countries was very strong. There was a help from United States to Italy, to many other countries in Europe, help of many European countries between each other. So this is something which we have to build upon, and we have to at the same time be very clear on the failures we saw in last 10 months. When it comes to your question, what I'm expecting from European Union's meeting, of course, I'm expecting a debate on better distribution of vaccines, because this is something we are still lagging behind. There is many people in Slovakia are seeing the situation, much better situation with vaccination in Israel, for example, in United States as well, in maybe United Kingdom. And they would expect that European Union would make the distribution much quicker than it is. Of course, it's not only about the procedures, it's about logistics, as we said, it's about the capacities of the private companies. And having said that, we need to understand and we need to keep in mind what General Allen said, that it's a very short time since the actually research on vaccination or vaccine and until now when the vaccine is distributed. So that's the first thing. And of course, it's connected with the topic of how to identify those people who have been already in the European Union and vaccinated, and how to make those people, the life for those people much easier. So how to make some measures in regards to those who have been vaccinated already.
Thanks. And I want to bring Mr. Gajdoš in on this question of vaccine distribution, because we've, of course, seen that vaccine rollout in Europe has been slow. We in the US are struggling with this. And it's not having the vaccine that helps us, it's getting those shots into the arms, as I think General Allen said. This is true at a time when we have this new, more highly contagious variant of COVID-19 that was discovered in the UK, but has spread to lots of other places since. From where you sit, what's the most important thing we need to do to improve the distribution of the vaccine?
So I think there's several things that need to happen, right? You know, I'm not going to talk about what should have been done. Unfortunately, you know, I wrote an open letter in October about the wave 2 and the need to prepare for the vaccine distribution. So nobody can say, oh, we didn't see this coming. You know, as I mentioned, we have a vaccine company as well for second generation, and I've seen the issue with cryogenic freezers. The one thing that I see that is really surprising is the issue of spoilage with this vaccine. I think developing a wait list of people who are ready to take vaccines right away will greatly improve numbers. So developing people who are able to take vaccines within hours, who live near Walgreens or near the distribution center for the vaccine, so that the vaccines don't go to waste because people don't show up, people do other things. So that's a very critical item, and that's a big part of the problem with the distributions. Unlike the AstraZeneca vaccine, they can, you know, stay functional for a long time. You know, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine have issues. So this is a part that going forward will greatly increase the speed. The second thing that I think needs to happen is to, I think, highlight benefits to people who get vaccinated. As Mr. State Secretary said, you know, I think making lives of people who have vaccines much easier, to make the incentive to get vaccinated very strong. I don't want to go into mandatory. I don't want to go into, you know, into that discussion. I don't think that's healthy. But showing and making the incentive for getting vaccinated very strong will greatly help further to increase the speed. So I don't think it's just a failure of distribution. It's also failure of some people not showing up and some people not getting vaccinated where they're supposed to. I think we're struggling with it in our healthcare workers in Slovakia. My understanding is it's mind-bending that some people are refusing to take vaccine in that situation.
Thank you for that, because it's a great lead into the last question I'm going to ask. And this one is for General Allen. It's a question from Alar Oliram, and he's asking, how do we deal with disinformation or misinformation regarding COVID-19, as well as the anti-vaxxer elements? Do you see any foreign involvement behind the spread of this?
Sure, there's no question that there is. You know, we've seen, for a whole variety of reasons, we've seen the hands of Russia in misinformation and disinformation. But frankly, in the United States, we didn't need any help from the Russians to make it a very difficult issue for us. We've had a study from one of the principal US universities that said the principal source of disinformation on COVID as a crisis, was the President of the United States, and that's in fact the case. we have politicized this almost to a criminal sense in my mind. We undermined at the national level efforts by national entities like the CDC to establish standards for things like mask wearing and social distancing, et cetera. Establish those national standards, expected the states to adhere to them. And then the President of the United States started to tweet out to his followers in certain states to liberate themselves from the onerous CDC standards that the governors were attempting to impose to get control of the spread of the disease, to flatten the curves in those states. And then there has been the consistent drumbeat that COVID is a hoax, and that it is a hoax spread politically to discredit the President of the United States. That line of misinformation has shaken, it's done two things. It's first polarized a large segment of the American electorate to believe that, but also then to believe that there's no need for them to take the vaccine, or that the vaccine is in fact an intent by the government to impose itself on the population. And then, look, this is going to be in the aftermath as we look back on this moment. This is going to be one of the darkest dimensions of how the United States dealt with this. And I've said several times in things that I've written and speeches that I've given, that while scientists and science will save us from this, only leadership can resolve the final problems here. And leadership telling the truth, telling the hard truth, preparing the population for what will be necessary for us as a people, and more broadly, us as a country, and more broadly than that, us as a community of nations to do this. Leaders have to tell the truth. It has to be depoliticized truth. It has to be based on science. And scientists and physicians need to stand next to those leaders and have a common narrative that is based on truths and facts in order for us to solve this. Right now, large segments of the American population, you call them anti-vaxxers, and there are other segments as well, that refuse to take the vaccine. It could be in the tens of millions. And we've got a lot of work to do, and the Biden administration has that to deal with, which is one of the reasons he wants to get 100 million people vaccinated in the first 100 days. Because one of the things that will convince people to take the vaccine will be seeing a large segment of the American population being vaccinated and remaining well in the moment of the worst moments, frankly, of this COVID crisis for us. That will be the convincing evidence that leadership is working and science is in fact functional and effective. And if we're able to do that, just have the evidence of leadership and science make Americans well, 100 million in the first 100 days, then I think we can really make progress on the issue of debunking the theories of the anti-vaxxers and those who believe this is a politically induced hoax.
Well, let me thank all three of you, Mr. State Secretary, Mr. Gajdoš, General Allen, for the leadership you are showing in your respective sectors. This is obviously a very hard challenge that we're facing. I appreciate the honesty all three of you showed in talking openly about the challenges we face, and thank you for making us all smarter. So with that, thanks also to everyone who joined us for this important conversation. And I wish everybody a relaxing weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.